Hi, this is Corey Johnston, and today's lesson is going to take place in the first 21 verses of the 11th chapter in the book of Acts. This is the capstone of a trilogy which began in the 10th chapter, which is 48 verses in length. I broke them down in the middle. I did one on each, and in that chapter we witnessed the expansion of the faith to Cornelius the first, a Roman centurion who was the first recorded Gentile convert in Christianity. Now, Christianity was already distinct from its Jewish parent in that they affirmed the same body of scriptures, the law, the writings, and the prophets, only they interpreted it they interpreted it as the one who came, Yahshua, Messiah, was the fulfillment of these prophecies. The Jews to this day are still looking for the Messiah, but Christianity truly became distinct from Judaism when they expanded the evangelism to Gentiles. Now, there were such things as Jews who were not Jews by national birth, they were converts and proselytes, but the evidence suggests that the convert had to come to Judaism. Christianity made an active and conscious effort to evangelize the globe and bring others to them, and that all began with Cornelius when he's visited by a vision, an angel, which tells him to send and seek out Peter, who is also visited by a vision the next day. The nature of it is described in his explanation and commentary on this chapter. But Peter is in the 11th chapter. He is back in Judah or Jerusalem, and he had been, now for the majority of his ministry, ever since he followed the Master into the Passover celebration, he had been there. He had been there for the first five chapters in the books of Acts. He's not really mentioned in the 6th or the 7th, but in the 8th we find him in Samaria, and he is inspecting in company of John Philip's progress in evangelizing Samaria. And then in the 9th chapter we read that Paul, the newly converted, the least likely of converts, who's actually going to be the most instrumental in drawing as many Gentiles to the flock of the new faith more than anyone else, visits Peter and others in Jerusalem, and this took place sometime in 37 A.D. Then we find him going to Lydda, then Joppa, where he stays for a while, and then at the men sent at Cornelius's behest, they draw him to Caesarea, the city where Cornelius was, and now we find him back in Jerusalem. And the opening verse reads, "And the apostles and brothers who were in Judah heard that the Gentiles also received the word of Yahweh." So this event is described in the closing verses of the previous chapter. The Gentiles received the Ruach Kadesh. They heard the word of Yahweh. They were converted and baptized not only in water but in the Spirit. So this upsets a lot because for centuries they had been conditioned to not associate or keep themselves separate from the Gentiles, and now the revolutionary shockwaves of Gentiles receiving what they thought as a unique Jewish treasure would have upsetted a lot of them. "And when Peter went up to Jerusalem, those of the circumcision were contending with him." Those of the circumcision would have been the Jews. The circumcision was the physical rite, which symbolizes one's entrance into the covenant community. And these particular men, we can gather, would have been legalistically minded, if not quite Judaizers. They would have been legalistically minded, slow to completely detach themselves from their Jewish roots, and that's why they were contending with him. And what were they saying? "Saying, you went into uncircumcised men and ate with them." this was a big no-no in the Jewish law. They were not to they were not allowed to have commercial contact with Gentiles and exist in the wider world, but they were forbidden to break bread with them or eat with them. And this is it's an accusatory tone when they say when they state the fact that he went into the uncircumcised and ate with them. Uncircumcised would have been Gentiles. This is something they would have been taught by experience, education, and conditioned by culture not to do. But Peter began and lay it forth in order, saying, so he's going to explain what transpired in the previous chapter. I was in the city of Joppa praying, and in a trance I saw a vision, a certain vessel descending like a great sheet, let down from the heavens by four corners, and it came to me. Now, visions are more often than not linked to prayer. Vision is one medium of revelatory communication which features a visual element of a supernatural origin to the beholder of the vision, and this came in response to prayer. And what did Peter see but a vessel or a sheet coming down from the heavens straight to him? So from heaven to earth to him. So from God to Peter. Having looked into it, I perceived and I saw four-footed beasts of the earth, and wild beasts, and creeping creatures, and the birds of the heavens. So a lot, if not all of these, would have been forbidden by the Mosaic dietary injunctions. Four-footed beasts they were designated unclean. Creeping creatures, those are insects, they're not clean. I know oysters were forbidden because they were considered the bottom feeders of the ocean. So likewise, those who dwell on the bottom of the earth, and many of the birds wouldn't have been permitted to eat, or wild beasts. Not all of them, but a lot of them. And I heard a voice saying to me, "Rise up, Peter, slay and eat." But I said, "Not at all, Master, because whatever is common or unclean has never entered into my mouth." Peter himself was a devout Jew, raised as such, and maintained much of his Judaism, a lot of it. This marks a true turning point, and a lot of people interpret the foods in variety of lights. Some see it as abolishing the Mosaic dietary law. Others see it as symbolic of the Gentile people, because as the voice says, do not call anything that Elohim has cleansed unclean or common. But we don't really endorse. We are personally inclined to the symbolic or the metaphorical interpretation. And the voice answered me again, and from the heavens, "What Elohim has cleansed to you, do not consider common." So Elohim has the higher authority. He has the determinative voice in determining what is clean and what is unclean. And for several centuries during the most previous dispensation, there were a lot of food sources and peoples he considered unclean. There were a lot of people, lepers, eunuchs, who were forbidden from the assembly of Israel, but that all changes. We witness this in the 8th chapter when Philip converts a single Ethiopian eunuch who was a Jew, who incidentally brought the good news straight to Ethiopia, having been baptized in the water by Philip, pondering a passage of Isaiah 53, which Philip explains to him more fully. And so almost from its inception, the church was a tri-continental movement. But to get back to the passage, "And this took place 3 times, and all were drawn up again into the heavens. So Peter refused. He was conditioned to regard this as a sin and a violation and an act of disobedience, even though the master, the one he calls master, who is sent from Elohim, declares a revolutionary reversal in what Peter thought was clean and unclean. And see, immediately 3 men stood before the house where I was, having been sent to me from Caesarea. These 3 men were 2 trusted household servants and 1 trustworthy soldier, sent at the behest of Cornelius, who is told in a vision to seek out a man named Simon, also known as Peter, who is residing at the home and residence of someone also named Simon a leather tanner. And so these 3 men show up immediately after the vision. The vision is perplexing. It doesn't immediately make sense, but its full meaning does reveal itself in the actions which transpire after the vision itself. And the Spirit said to me to go with them, not doubting at all. And these 6 brothers also went with me, and we went into the man's house. So they traveled Joppa northward to Caesarea. They were both coastal towns. I know Joppa was seaport town, but Caesarea would have been close to the port, the sea, if not exactly on it. So this takes him from Joppa, where he had been a while. He had been there since he healed a woman by the name of Tabitha, or resurrected rather, a woman by the name of Tabitha, also known as Dorcas in the Greek. And so they go into the man's house, and what happens after that? And he told us how he had seen an angel standing in his house, who said to him, "Send men to Joppa, and call for Simon, who is also called Peter." So Simon was his birth name, his Jewish name. Peter was the name that was given to him by the Messiah. It translates as rock, because he was to be the rock of his church. And but the angel had visited a Gentile, Cornelius, who was described as a devout, God-fearing Gentile. He probably wasn't circumcised or quite a Jew, but that is no hindrance in becoming a Christian. And of course, the controversy of circumcision emerges almost immediately in response to the influx of the new Gentile converts in the faith. "Who shall speak to you words by which you shall be saved, you and all your house?" So the angel, Yahweh and Elohim works through both angelic and human mediators. So the angel tells him all that he needs to know. Without the angelic intervention, he would have no way of knowing who Simon was or what he could do or where he was. But he's told that he's gonna tell him that all that he needs to know in order to bring salvation to him and his entire family. In his house, at the scene described in Acts 10, you read, he is not alone, but accompanied by friends and family. "And as I began to speak, the Ruach Kadesh fell upon them, as upon us at the beginning." The beginning would have been Pentecost, the event, the details and descriptions of the event of which we read of in Acts 2, when the Ruach Kadesh came and visited them, indwelling powerfully as the Messiah had promised. This took place on the week of the holiday of the Pentecost, and its arrival signified the new transition into the divine protagonist from Acts all the way to the end of the New Testament. The Spirit replaces the Son as the divine protagonist, who earlier replaced Yahweh the Father, who was the protagonist of the Old Testament. Yahshua becomes the protagonist in the 4 Gospels, Acts to Revelation. It's the Ruach Kadesh. "And I remembered the words of the Master, how he said, John indeed baptized in water, but you shall be baptized in the Ruach Kadesh. This had been told to all the disciples in accompanying him, witnessing his ascension and return into heaven. This is we read of in Acts 1:5. John himself, John the Baptist, to be distinguished from the apostle, the cousin and forerunner and herald of the Messiah to come, he himself also said something similar, that he baptized in water. Water is symbolic of repentance, but baptism in the fire in Ruach Kadesh, which he designates to Yahshua's ministry, is baptism unto salvation. So these men, they were dunked in water, so they were both baptized by water and perhaps more importantly by spirit. So if Elohim gave them the same gift as he gave us when we believed on the Master Yahshua Messiah, how was I able to withstand Elohim? So even though Peter did show some hints at resistance, at least to the angel in the dream, once it became clear that the meaning, the entire purpose and interpretation and explanation of his dream was to spread the good news to the Gentiles, who are henceforth to be full and equal partners and partakers of the same salvation history as the Jews, and they will fast displace them as the majority in the new Christian sect. But there's no sense in resisting. He resisted out of confusion earlier, but once it was all made clear, there's no logic or reason or valid explanation to continue the resistance. And having heard this, they were silent and praised Elohim, saying, Then Elohim has indeed also given to the Gentiles repentance to life. So these Jews, the circumcised party, were fully persuaded by his argument, having heard only secondhand this story. They were shocked by the scandal. All they knew is that Peter had broken bread with a Gentile, but there was no, at least inference in their earlier dialogue, that he had initiated a revolutionary conversion, which would have ramifications outside of its immediate conversion. But they were fully persuaded and convinced by the argument that the Gentiles, they remained silent for a while, and then they came to the conclusion that the same gift had been given equally of repentance to life to the Gentiles. It was no longer an exclusive Jewish possession. Then indeed they who were scattered because of the persecution that arose over Stephen passed through to Phoenicia and Cyprus and to Antioch, speaking the word to no one except the Jews only. So the martyrdom of Stephen, of which we read in the 7th chapter, in the first 3 chapters of the next verses of the next chapter, we read that the persecution had scattered them. There was a Jewish Christian diaspora of sorts, which sent them all outside of the parameters of the Promised Land. They at this time they were in Phoenicia, which is the modern country of Lebanon, and Cyprus, which is an island in the Mediterranean, and Antioch, which after Rome and Alexandria would have been the 3rd largest metropolis in the Roman Empire. It was located in Syria. There were 16 cities named Antioch, but this was the most significant one. But those who had been scattered because of the persecution limited their message only to the Jews. They only went to the synagogues. They only spoke to those who they were familiar with or had that common background in. But some of them were men from Cyprus and Cyrene, who when they had come to Antioch spoke to the Greeks, bringing the good news, the Master Yahshua. So some of them from Cyprus, that's the Mediterranean island, and Cyrene, which corresponds to the territory of the modern country of Libya, when they came to Antioch, spoke to the Greeks. There would have been a Greek community or Gentiles, so they took it upon themselves. They were the ones who broke the ground from distinct from their former predecessors who limited their message only to the Jews. And the hand of the master was with them, and a great number, having believed, turned to the master. So because the hand was guiding and enabling this this realization of this mass conversion, and their conversion, it was total. They had fully turned to the master, and it was all through the power of the Spirit and in tandem with the master. And then in the what comes after, that's all the verses we're gonna read. Comment on verse by verse, but we'll give you the Cliff Notes version of what transpires after we read of Barnabas, and he is summoned to Antioch, and then he eventually travels to Paul, to seek Saul, as he was still known then, and then they went to Antioch, where they stayed for an entire year. This would have been, the events just described would have taken place in 40 AD. So they spent a whole year there, and that would be eventually the launching pads of Paul's 3 missionary journeys. And we also read that it was in Antioch that they first became called Christians. Prior to this point, they were into something indistinct, at least in name, from the Jews. And we also read of a prophecy of Agab, which anticipates a worldwide famine, which took place when Claudius Caesar was on the throne in Rome. So they organized a relief in advance of the famine, and they did it through Paul and Barnabas. And that's all the time we have for today. Thank you so much. I'm so glad you're here. Stay tuned until next time. I'll see you soon. Bye-bye.